Well, I'm Lexi Posse. I'm the VP of Data Science and Analytics at Zartico. So I lead our data science team in synthesizing our data into travel and tourism relevant insights. And I'm here with Natalie Jameson. Natalie, if you could introduce yourself real quickly.
Yes, absolutely. As Lexi said, I'm Natalie, the Director of Insights and Business Intelligence. With Zartico, he will kill me for saying this, but I have to say, I am no Jay Kinghorn, but he apologizes that he couldn't make it today. He had a scheduling conflict and he's actually about to go on stage in El Paso. But I'm stepping in for him today, and it's just wonderful to be here. Thank you for joining us.
And Natalie is short selling herself. She is excellent at what she does. Um, So before we talk about geolocation data, I'm going to talk about cupcakes, and I promise I'll get back around to the data part. But everybody loves cupcakes. They're fun. They're delicious. Not all cupcakes are created equal. So here's Kara's Cupcakes in San Francisco, named the best cupcakes in the US. So they source their ingredients from local farms. Their recipes are fine-tuned, tested, developed, refined by a team of professional chefs. Um, and they're very different than, say, a Pillsbury funfetti cake mix, right? Which can be really good in a pinch, or if you want to whip up a quick treat for a kid's birthday party. But if you have an event or a person that is really important that you'd like to celebrate, you'd probably want to go with Kara Cupcakes over the box mix. So how does this relate to geolocation data? Well, it's all about the quality of the data and, of course, the quality of the recipe and the care that's been put into designing it. So, in data, we often say that good decisions made on bad data are just bad decisions you don't know about yet. And that's very much the case when it comes to geolocation data. So what is geolocation data? Well, it's data that's generated through apps and ads that are on your mobile phone. They're collected on an opt-in and anonymized basis. They can come either directly from apps or from SDKs associated with digital banner ads that are run within those apps. Here's a common misconception about geolocation data, that it is always on, watching you every step you take. And that's simply not the case. So geolocation data is not always on. In fact, 90% of the devices in the data set are seen less than one time a day in our observation. However, these devices that are seen infrequently account for a minority of all the observations. So when we look at the whole pool of devices, we see a number of things that are reasonably impacting device coverage and their likelihood of being seen in a given time and place. These include user behavior, so what apps they have on their phone, what privacy settings they personally have enabled, how they use their phones and the apps on them in different locations. There's also the impact of privacy regulations, which can have sort of geographical impact. One of the things that we've observed is that they don't tend to have as acute an impact temporally when they're rolled out. But maybe one of the things that's sort of factoring into lower coverage within certain geographic regions relative to higher coverage in other areas. There's also app and vendor policies and contracts, as well as those apps and those vendors' sort of popularity, and that waxes and wanes over time within different demographics. There's also issues such as self-service and reception, which can be impacted by terrain or by the region itself, and other things which impact the chances that the device are observed in a given place and time. So this all sounds very complicated, but it's really not unfamiliar from some other things that we're already familiar with historically. Basically, what it comes down to is that geolocation data is a sample. So not all devices report with equal frequency. That means that at a given event, you're not going to see everybody that's there at that particular place in that particular time. And there may be some biases present within the data stream, just like in any data set. However, the normalized data provides a representative sample that we can use for analysis. And it's larger in most cases than your traditional survey method. So if you have a normalization method that can create a more representative sample, then you really get to leverage this much, much larger sample size that you get out. So over longer periods of time, we actually see the majority of devices relative to the US population And that's quite a lot of coverage when you're looking over longer periods of time, broader geographic regions. So here's a very boring graph, US population by month. Now it obviously sort of waxes and wanes, mostly waxes, but for the sake of illustration, we're going to be modeling this here as just a straight line. Doesn't vary much over time. That's a very different story from the US raw device counts within a large geolocation data stream. So again, when you see certain apps can come in and out of the data set or grow in popularity amongst different demographics, you may see the impact of changing user behavior with respect to how they select their opt-in settings, or even different changes in the device's software and the privacy settings that it defaults to. So you can see that if you were to just look at year-over-year comparisons based on the raw device counts, you might see, say, a 300, 400% growth, which is obviously not realistic no matter how optimistic you may be. So that's where normalization comes in, and we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into that, but I wanted to just kind of set that background and discuss how we want to think about this using some metaphors that might be a little bit more familiar. So we already discussed that a device is not a person in the sense that it may represent a person, but not every person at an event is going to be represented by a device within the data set. It's better to think of a device as a survey respondent and an observation as a response to a survey which asks, where are you right now? So continuing in this loose analogy, you might think of normalization as being analogous to a type of survey panel. Our anomaly filtering, where we filter out geospatial anomalies, as removing incomplete or erroneous responses to the survey. And then, of course, your basic principles like sample size and representativity still apply sort of in both cases with the survey and with geolocation data. So here's an example from maybe a more traditional survey. These people were asked how much of a member of the family their pets were. And you can see in this column here with the active panelists remaining, how many people responded at different times. So obviously that fluctuates as well. There's also sort of different representativity within the pool. But then when that's aggregated up into a general response, one, the results are reported as percentages, which is also often generally best practice here as well, to report things in percentages and ratios. But then there's also typically some kind of weighting applied in order to make sure that when you're sort of doing the roll up across the survey, you're having generally representative responses relative to the population. So if you happen to have more respondents in the survey case from people who are members of a certain demographic versus another, you would sort of statistically weight up the representativity of the underrepresented demographic within your survey. And it's a very similar thing with geolocation data. But now with geolocation data, we're often trying to make sure that you have a representative sample with respect to things which are relevant to understanding this particular industry or the questions that might come up within trying to strategize, such as, you know, where are people coming from? Where are they going? So you want to make sure that your geolocation weighting or normalization strategy takes those things into account. However, you also have to take into account a number of factors that are specific to geolocation data that speak more to how often a device is observed, its likelihood to be observed within those places, that sort of thing. So we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into geolocation normalization in a moment here. But I just wanted to sort of frame this up in the context that many of these general overarching principles should already be familiar. They're just being applied in a new setting. Now, with sort of more traditional methods, oftentimes you have more control over the methodologies. When you're trying to gather a larger data set, oftentimes the cost of getting that very large data set, right, up into billions or trillions even of device observations, oftentimes the cost of that is having to do additional weighting, cleaning, and normalization on top of the data in order to get reliable insights. So you get an enormous sample size, but it comes at the cost of having to do more sophisticated modeling in order to extract the actual insights. I just wanted to say a brief word about some of the news regarding NEAR, the geolocation data provider that we've worked with. we have been had an ongoing relationship with Mir, and in particular, their former CTO, now CEO, who's very familiar with geolocation data, its behaviors. And we feel very confident that between that relationship and our normalization methodologies, which accommodate the device pool very well, that we're still able to provide a stable source of data and insights. So, the benefits of normalization is that it provides this additional stability. We also have a number of internal monitoring and testing protocols, which is good practice regardless. So when you're using one of these types of data that tends to be a little bit larger, but maybe a little bit more complex, you'll want to make sure that you're continuing to monitor it to make sure it fits the needs of the methodologies that you're applying to it. And what we found is that we're still well within the bounds and have consistently been within which our methodologies would be functional. So the key takeaways from this is that a device is not a person. Not everybody that's seen at an event or is present at an event will be represented by a device within the pool. Device counts also help you understand whether or not you have a sufficient sample for reliable analysis. So sample size matters in geolocation as in anything else. You can look at device counts in order to help you understand whether you have sufficient sample, but in order to look at insights and trends, you'll want to apply the appropriate normalization methodologies. And you'll also want to make sure that you're sort of monitoring the sample size to make sure that you have enough sample to make a statistically relevant decision based on insight that you're driving from it. And then, of course, lastly, most of what you already know at this sort of conceptual level about good survey methodology and analysis can be applied broadly to geolocation data. And we'll jump in a little bit now into what are some of the differences in how we think about this, what are some of the kind of specific tools and technologies that we have applied and that we recommend applying to geolocation data in order to apply those same general principles of good practice into this new landscape of geolocation data, which can be a more robust and deeper, but also more complex and nuanced, and in some ways difficult to work with data set. All right, so let's do a little bit of a deep dive into the normalization. And we're also going to be talking a little bit about some of the additional enrichments. So continuing in the cupcake analogy, of course, you want to start with your quality of raw ingredients. We have an enormous data set to work with here, but then you need to also apply your normalization, enrichment on top of it, any sort of filtering, quality control of ingredients, and then we're going to be talking as well about points of interest and the relevance of points of interest in data presentation to a geolocation data strategy. All right, so what is normalization? So I wanted to back up a little bit here and say that normalization is actually a very general term that describes a really broad class of statistical tools. So it's not one particular type of methodology. There are many, many different ways that you could go about normalization, and different normalization strategies may have strengths and weaknesses in different areas. So with the normalization strategy that we use, we have crafted that normalization strategy to be relevant to the types of questions that we'd like to ask within destination management and marketing. And sort of, you also have to take into account the type of data that you're taking in with respect to that problem space, the space of questions that you're trying to answer. So what is the data that I have available to work with? What types of questions am I trying to answer? And the methodology that you develop has to connect up the dots between those two things. So I like to think analogously of normalization like a Steadicam or a shock absorber for geolocation data. So you might be going over a little bit of a bumpy road. There might be some volatility within the underlying data, but normalization, which is the stabilizer, helps sort of stabilize the view of the data that you're receiving and making insights based off of. So again, sort of analogously similar to panel weighting and surveys, but now we have to use some more sophisticated mathematical tools in order to incorporate some of our knowledge about how the devices behave into being able to reliably answer questions that are sort of relevant to the destination. And normalization is absolutely essential for increasing confidence in the data. So again, there are lots of different ways to think about normalization. I also like to sometimes use the metaphor of a funhouse mirror. So you're looking at an object in a funhouse mirror, the surface of the mirror may be distorted in some way. Normalization allows you to sort of reconstruct a faithful image of that object. But what's necessary in order to be able to reconstruct that image, of course, is a knowledge of what the distortions within the mirror are, right? And so the more that you can understand about the data, the deeper your ability to test the data, and where any of those sort of warping or partialities may be, the more you can correct those within your techniques. So it's not just about, you know, this demographic representativity, although certainly you will want to balance for things like origin markets and any sort of biases introduced by looking through the POI lens, which we do accommodate for. You also want to make sure that you're adjusting for the behavior of the data itself, how that may change over time according to all of those things we discussed previously. So user behavior and privacy regulations, sort of what's in the app pool. The list of that is sort of endless, but if you can extract what's relevant, you can come up with a normalization methodology which balances for all of that. So with our normalization, there's a few different things that we look at and balance for within the context of that data. And we know that there's lots of different things that can sort of causally impact the data and its fluctuations. But what we're really looking for is what impacts our ability to answer the relevant questions. And oftentimes that is about, again, reconstructing this whole image of reality from the partial picture of the data. So we take into account shifts in volume and frequency of observations, differences in particular origin market coverage, how confident we are in your evening location as people move around, and we reparse and analyze the data regularly. This visitor dampening effect is something we've observed, which is that, you know, people use their phones differently on the road and when they're traveling than they do at home. And how differently they use it depends on the particular apps that they have on their phone and the apps that are in the pool. So that's an effect that has to be accommodated for explicitly within the normalization strategy as well. And then lastly, we also have available to us spending data, which we can use as sort of a twin data set in order to strengthen the accuracy of our normalization factors. So triangulating against other data sets that you may have, and being able to do that within the normalization methodology itself, recognizing that these two data sets do show different things. So you'll want to make sure that it's not the only thing you're going off of. You have all of these other factors taken into consideration as well, but that creates generally a very strong and robust data normalization protocol. So here, just as an illustration, you'll see sort of these trends in the raw data in the background here in the darker colors. And you can see that the normalized data offers a much more stable picture. So while the raw data may vary significantly over time, you see this stable picture with nice, consistent seasonal trends, and also seeing sort of weekly trends even consistently emerging within the normalized data. So that would be indicative of the type of signal that represents actual visitation to your region. Again, the difference between actual visitation to your region and what devices are being picked up within your data set are very, those are very different things. And normalization is what allows us to connect up the dots between the two of those in order to provide that nice, stable orange line you see there, where we're getting to see these seasonal annual trends and even these sort of weekly weekend peaks. Another thing that we also take into account, so this is sort of where that analogy to surveys leans into, are there erroneous or partial responses to the survey? This would be sort of our analogous equivalent. There are a number of geospatial specific anomalies. Oftentimes these come from devices reporting coarse location as opposed to precise location. So in order to offer insights about particular POIs, we know that it's important to have only precise geolocation data in the pool in order to provide those insights. However, when a device reports a coarse location, it will often, all of those devices will congregate within a particular point, and those are those spikes that you see on the map. So what you can see on the left-hand side, so the right-hand side is before any of the filtering that we've applied. On the left-hand side, you can see that filtering applied, and you get a much clearer picture of where the actual congestion is on roads and within POIs within the city, and you don't have these sort of anomalous artifacts clouding the picture of where that congestion within the destination is. So some of the key takeaways from this discussion of normalization and data cleaning is normalization is normal. It is just a part of taking this partial picture of the world that's provided by a data set and generalizing it out into an understanding of reality as a whole. So normalization should absolutely be applied in some way or form to any data set if it's a normalization that takes into account both the data that is coming in and its qualities and the types of questions that you'd like to be answering with that data. That's really where the sweet spot is with choosing a normalization methodology. So if you're trying to select a vendor based on their normalization strategy and their data cleaning, ask what they do to ensure a clean data signal, ask what they do in order to normalize, how that's going on, and then how they validate that the numbers they're producing are accurate. And if you're thinking of developing your own normalization protocol, it can be very complicated, but some of the key tenets that we've discussed here are certainly things to look out for. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Natalie for sort of the last really critical piece of ensuring that you have a solid geolocation data strategy, which is really the place-based strategy.
All right, thank you, Lexi. So we're going to start talking about why do we need POIs, or points of interest, places of interest, sometimes they're referred to. Why can't I just polygon my entire destination, or just chunks of my destination, neighborhoods of my destination? There's several different reasons for that that we're going to talk about today. Lexi, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So kind of keeping with that same analogy that Lexi has touched on a few times to help frame this conversation, when we think about surveys, right? We like to say to think of these POIs like they're survey intercept points. And when you think about it in that framework, it really illuminates the importance of how we choose them and really some best practices. So starting at the top, finding those good POIs can actually help to filter out unimportant visitor signal. We'll talk about roadways in a moment. Of course, having these POIs within your geolocation data can help surface those visitor behavior trends and habits. If you just polygoned your entire destination or chunks of it, you might not be able to really understand how different travelers kind of consume your destination from a seasonal perspective or that type of traveler perspective. Of course, they identify those top places within your destination. That's probably the no-brainer. But what's also important with POIs is understanding, not just from that visitor perspective, those top drivers, but how visitors and residents, right, are using or not using certain retail, restaurants, and areas of your destination. And again, like I mentioned, those different traveler groups. So certain POIs, you might see that New York visitor, is really engaged with compared to, say your Miami visitor or something. So getting down to that granular level can really illuminate how folks are consuming your destination. So we talk a lot here at Zartico about the importance of a place-based strategy. And so what makes a good POI strategy, place-based strategy? Certainly covering a full array of your visitor type. So not just focusing on, let's say, that convention persona or that business persona or that leisure persona, but really selecting, incorporating points of interest that are going to capture everyone, those folks just visiting, friends and family, folks potentially even coming into town for medical reasons. I am here in the beautiful city of Baltimore. Please come visit if you never have. We have world-class Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore, right? And so we do see a lot of that medical persona as well as youth sports. So really making sure that we're being diverse with our POIs that we're selecting. Certainly representing all regions. If you selected points of interest all in your downtown, guess what? You're going to get data that tells you your downtown is booming. And that's, of course, because you don't have that diverse layout throughout your entire destination, but also with regions thinking about categories, right? So not bucketing everything into retail or restaurants and hotels, but really making sure that you've got a good look into each of those categories. Lexi, you can go into the next. So I'd like to talk about 5 different ways POIs can accidentally sabotage your geolocation data. So starting off with the first one, again, this might sound very like common sense, but it is surprising how important this is. Too few of POIs, right? And that can be across your entire destination, just concentrated in one area, concentrated to one persona, and concentrated into one category. Those are all going to give you inaccurate data. So again, going back, making sure that you have a high resolution view into your destination, and really making sure that you have a robust amount of POI. So that's number 1. Number 2, bias POIs. Again, going back to making sure you're not selecting POIs based off of just that convention business versus just that leisure business. That's only going to increase bias into your data. Number 3 is a really, really big one, inconsistency, right, in how POIs are drawn. So on the left-hand side, what you're looking at, this is a big shopping mall with, of course, parking lots all around it, but also some other, restaurants, other retail not attached to that shopping mall. On the left-hand side, that kind of teal outline is the drawing of this POI, which incorporates everything. And on the right-hand side, we're just strategically drawing the exact outline of that mall and those corresponding businesses. So it's really, 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 really critical that the drawing of the POI is done with this level of accuracy and precision. Surprisingly, the data difference between the two is about a 57% difference in unique device counts, which is massive. So the drawing of the individual POI is so critical to the data that shows up within your platform. And number 4, roadway. Of course, it's very, very common for us to get the question, hey, we closed down our streets because we're having a festival for 1 week in the fall. We'd really like to, polygon, just that street, but it's 1 week in the fall, and polygoning just that one street means you're going to be picking up on a significant amount of road traffic, and that road traffic might not even be stopping in your destination, right? They might just be passing through. So we really believe in excluding roadways to take out all of that noise of the data. And we've also found through our learning that the roadways aren't even needed, because when an event is happening in a festival situation like that, all of the other POIs that have been drawn around that event, you're seeing that boom in that retail, those restaurants and bars. So you don't even really need the roadway to answer the question that you're seeking. And then number 5, out of boundary points of interest. We all know visitors do not see boundary lines. We have the Guinness Brewery here in Baltimore. It's actually out in the county. It's not Baltimore City, but visitors don't know that, right? And so we all have these out of boundary, just over the boundary, that are maybe huge drivers and actually send, visitors into your destination. And so we really do want to understand, well, how do those out of boundaries, what are they doing for my destination? How can I get more people to come in after they visited that out of boundary? But it's really, really critical that if you do have these, that they are separated from your in boundary POIs, because again, folks could come to that out of boundary, not come to your destination. So looking at data strictly at that out of boundary is just going to create noise and inaccuracy in the interpretation of the data.
Thanks, Natalie. So just to kind of recap some of what we've talked about here, how do you get the most from your geolocation data? So sort of taking everything we talked about with normalization, with the POI strategy, and really kind of bringing it back down to earth for a minute. We'll talk about reporting as an example, right? how do you use this within reporting? So like with surveys, we recommend reporting in percentages. Those are generally going to be more stable and a better practice. You'll also want to anchor to other trusted data sets, right? So you might want to look at your restaurant tax revenues and then use your geolocation data to inform how many of those restaurant patrons were visitors. If you're trying to understand trail usage, you could use a trail counter to count the absolute numbers and then use geolocation data to understand whether the typical users of the park are residents or visitors. So, whether you have 63% of resident park users as visitors. National park visitation, you could use as another external number, and then use geolocation data to understand what your top visitor origin markets to the park are. So being able to pair these with other trusted data sets in order to tell a more robust story about the destination is also good practice for reporting. Also, we want to use the most reliable views of the data, right? So when you're sort of zooming out geographically or zooming out over time, you're generally going to get a larger sample size and a more robust picture. We'll talk a little bit more about, this sort of reliability matrix, but the general idea is when you zoom out over space or time, you'll generally have a more reliable picture. Zooming in on either dimension, you'll just want to be mindful of how you're limiting the sample size, which brings me to the third point: monitor your sample sizes. And then allow normalization in this case to complete 30-day stabilization period. So for us, because our normalization takes into account a number of seasonal and other trends that are measured off of multiple data sets, there's oftentimes a lag between when the final revision of normalization will be. So here's the reliability grid. We kind of talked about this. Here's a little visual that I think can help illustrate that. You have sort of this geography dimension and this time dimension, and you can either zoom in to be smaller and more precise in either one of these dimensions. So looking at either a POI level insight, sort of zoomed in on the geography dimension, or a 1 day, 1 hour event within the time dimension, or you can zoom out on either one of these. So you can look across your entire destination, or you can look across a longer period of time. And generally, if you're zooming in down to this corner, so at the POI and daily level, you're likely to be limiting your sample sizes more significantly. So if you're trying to look at a particular event within a POI, we actually recommend looking at the entire destination rather than that POI, not only because you'll generally get higher sample sizes, but also because it provides a more holistic lens with which to analyze the event impact on your destination. So generally speaking, when in doubt, zoom out. And you can have this sort of reliability matrix in mind, thinking about, I have these two dimensions. If I really want to understand something that's small in space, can I zoom out of time, and vice versa? So stay in the sweet spot. A few examples of maybe ways that you may want to think about these different types of insights or metrics by time granularity. So if you're looking at visitor characteristics by region, you can often do that on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, or yearly basis. Visitor behavior by category, similarly. When you're looking at seasonal visitation trends, maybe you want to zoom out a little bit more to reduce some of that noise. So looking at monthly or quarterly level. Origin market mix, oftentimes with your top origin markets, you can look at that broken out by week, month, quarter, or year. And then if you want to zoom into a particular primary POI and look at an origin market breakdown, now you're zooming in significantly over the time dimension or into the geographic dimension. So we recommend keeping that time dimension quite broad, which means looking at that particular POI and its origin market breakdown, maybe on a quarterly or even annual basis. So here's some of the key takeaways we hope you take with you from this presentation today. One, geolocation data is a raw material. So, in our particular case, geolocation data is an incredibly large and robust data set. It has a lot of really granular insights across many different spaces over many different times. You can sort of zoom in and out. But the cost of that is that in order to get reliable insights from it, you often have to apply sophisticated processing methodologies in order to get that reliable insight out of it. So you start with the raw material, and then you have these sort of recipes that you develop, whether that be a filtering recipe, whether that be testing or monitoring to make sure that the quality of the raw ingredients is suitable for the recipe that you're going to be putting together. And then normalization, of course, being a very complex recipe in this particular case, sort of brings it all together into this holistic picture of what the data is really telling you about reality. So a device is not a person. You cannot just count devices in order to understand how many people were at your destination. And normalization is normal. So being able to take that partial picture of reality that data provides. Data almost always provides a partial picture. The census might be one example where it attempts to provide a whole picture of reality, but as we all know, even that isn't complete, right? So when you have any data set, you're often dealing with a particular sample, which means that you have a partial picture of reality. And understanding how to extend that partial picture of reality into a whole picture of reality that actually reflects what's happening within your destination. That's all the heavy lifting that normalization does. So, you know, we have a single word that we kind of colloquially use, normalization, to apply to those kind of processes. But really it's this whole endeavor of how do you extrapolate from this partial picture of reality into this whole picture of reality in a way that is both, one, true to the qualities of the data, but two, most importantly, true to the types of questions that you want to answer. So a correct normalization methodology for your purposes really needs to know clearly what the two of those are and how to connect up the dots between them. And because we're situated primarily within this space and we understand the strategic questions that need to be resolved here, we're able to connect up the dots between that data set and what types of questions we want to be able to answer. Whereas, you know, if you're applying a normalization methodology that's maybe a little bit more, you know, out of the box, cookie cutter type of approach, like the box cake mix, it might not be quite so suited to be able to answer the types of strategic questions that you'd like to be able to answer that are relevant to, you know, your strategy. All POIs are not created equal, so the place-based strategy is critically important in making sure that through that lens of the POI, you're really getting a picture of what's most relevant to your destination and visitation within it. When in doubt, zoom out. So really lean into that reliability matrix. If you want to get really granular with respect to space, zoom out with time. If you want to get really granular with respect to time, so down to a day, zoom out in space, so maybe out to the whole destination level. And then finally, the answers you get depend on the questions you ask, right? So that's down to kind of this approach to normalization and processing the data more generally, presenting the data. What types of questions do you want to ask? You know, that's where a lot of the place-based strategy comes in as well. We're trying to answer questions that are relevant to the visitor economies within these destinations as a whole. So just like within normalization and within the place-based strategy, it all comes down to what the ultimate goal of what you're trying to do with this data is. So just wanted to say a quick few words on what we in particular do within our data sets to offer the most reliable insights when it comes to geolocation data. We have hotspot and other geospatial anomaly removal techniques. So these were developed in-house in order to remove a lot of the anomalous data that could otherwise skew these types of insights. We also have the ability to identify high-frequency devices which may have more reliable insights for certain types of metrics, right? So if you want to see certain types of information, you might need to limit yourself to devices which have a certain quality, such as being observed with a certain frequency. And then you'll want to be able to apply, say, a normalization protocol that's appropriate to that. So that's what we've all done with our data. You want to ensure reliability and accuracy of your listed evening location, which drives origin market insights. You want a robust normalization protocol, one which takes into account both the qualities of the data, types of questions you're trying to answer. And then we also pair that with some of our other data sources, such as spending and credit card, as sort of an additional calibrating external factor that we can lean on to make sure and be confident that the results we're producing are valid and reliable. When it comes to the place-based strategy, you'll want to really lean into that, understanding what types of POIs best capture the relevant information within your region, what the correct balance of that should be, making sure that you have good practices in place for the polygons that represent these places, and then identifying any sort of extraneous noise, such as those that arise within roadway traffic. So these are all part of our geolocation data processing pipeline for our partners. And this is some of how we sort of practically take some of what we've spoken about with respect to best practices and distill it into something that we feel confident provides the most reliable types of insights and actionable types of insights that you could get from this data. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I see we have some Q&A in the chat, so I'll go ahead and stop share so we can take a look at those. All right, let's see. So I see a Q&A from Diane. I heard that normalization was only required if looking at this data over time. Do you use normalization when studying a several-day event? If yes, does it differ from when looking at the data over time? This is a really, really great question. So I think this is kind of a perfect illustration of what we were talking about before with what types of questions are you trying to answer. So with looking at the data over time or trying to compare, I would certainly recommend using normalization, and here's why. So over a several-day event, you would definitely want to use normalization, even if you're just looking over time, right? Because you can have these fluctuations on a day-by-day basis. They are extremely common. But the second piece of that is that, you know, even though you might be looking at a single snapshot in time, and so you might not think of having to sort of balance across a longer period of time, you also have all of these different factors like user behavior, the particular POIs under consideration within your study, and the different origin markets that are playing into it. And those factors all need to be balanced as well. So, you know, normalization is something which takes into account not just fluctuations over time, but fluctuations in some of these other dimensions like origin market and POI category and visitor behavior. And so you'd certainly want to use a normalization strategy which balances or takes all of those factors into account for an analysis, even for a single day event.
Lexi, there's another question here, and just context for you. This was asked before you dove into normalization, but the question is, do you weight your data, or does it come weighted from your sources, or do you suggest destinations should weight it themselves?
Yeah, this is another fantastic question. So we ingest our data raw. And the reason for that is that we want to be able to do the balancing that is necessary to answer the particular types of questions we know that our partners want to answer. So we do the weighting ourselves, and we've developed our own methodology completely built from scratch and sort of purpose built in order to, you know, answer the questions from the data that are most relevant to the industry. So we try to do all that heavy lifting for the partners. In general, I would recommend finding a vendor who does. Again, this is an extremely difficult thing, I think, to do on your own, and probably more time consuming than destinations would like, who have, you know, honestly bigger strategic questions and initiatives to focus on. So we do all of our own weighting. We've developed the methodology, sort of tailor-made. And another consideration is that I believe you need the raw data. I strongly believe that you need the raw data in order to apply a relevant weighting strategy. You need the raw data in order to understand the different things that need to be done in order to balance the data and to do that analysis. And, you know, when you're dealing with very, very, very large data sets, you really kind of need the computational power and the ability to be able to analyze that. So that's, yeah, we do it all in-house, and I would probably recommend trying to avoid having to do that weighting yourself.
Wonderful. There's one more here. I assume came in when I was talking about POIs. Can we do one-off POI studies for events, or would all POIs drawn need to be quote unquote important year-round? This is a fantastic question. So going back to that, you know, place-based strategy when you're setting up geolocation and choosing those POIs. Absolutely not. You do not need to only be picking POIs that are important year-round. And think of it as Major League Baseball stadiums, right? NFL football stadiums. Well, those are going to be really, really active for a few months during a season. And then they might go, inactive for many, many weeks and months of the year. And that's totally okay. You still want to incorporate that into your primary points of interest because of the activity that does happen during certain seasons. Totally fine that they go a little silent outside of, hopefully some other concerts and mixed use of that stadium. But yeah, it does not need to be important 52 weeks a year, 365 days. So great question. Bob, another great question. Does your methodology vary from small, medium, large destinations? Lexi, I'll
Yeah,
let you answer that one.
yeah, for sure. So I can sort of speak to the normalization data cleaning side. So I think our methodologies tend to be um, more universal in the sense that they will sort of dynamically accommodate themselves for the differences in size and composition of different destinations. So in a way, yes, and that the algorithms are sort of accommodating themselves according to a number of different characteristics that may manifest in different ways for large and small organizations. But we really try to develop algorithms and approaches that are universal enough that they can accommodate different types of partners. I mean, what we've seen is that everybody is different, right? And so if you design a method with a particular type of destination in mind, that is not flexible enough to accommodate the reality of how many different types of places there are and how many different types of people interact with it, then you're really going to be biasing yourself for some of these different destinations. So our algorithms are dynamic in that they sort of take into account and automatically adjust for different things that may manifest differently for different types of destinations. But the same kind of general principles apply across the board. What are you using for weights? Okay, that's a really great question. So I won't dive too deep into the math of it. But I think that one of the important things I wanted to touch on since this question was asked is that we have an explicit methodology, right? So we are measuring things that we know are relevant to the probability that a device is observed at a place that is relevant to a destination. And that are relevant to the questions, and we are constructing our methodology from those. And that might seem like a no-brainer, but I wanted to contrast that to another approach that you might see taken, which is a more black box sort of approach, where you have a bunch of variables that you think might be relevant, and then you throw it into some black box algorithm that you can't pop the hood on, and then you just have some sort of set of things that you do know, and tell the machine to go figure it out itself. That can be a little bit of a higher risk strategy in a lot of ways because you don't really know what the machine is picking up on. So we do have a number of sort of dynamic algorithms that we've developed, but at the end of the day, we do know probabilistically and mathematically exactly how those weights are constructed, exactly why, exactly what's being measured from the data that leads us to develop those weights. And then importantly, in whatever insight is delivered into the platform, we can backtrack through what the weights were, test the weights, understand them, and do any kind of troubleshooting there. Whereas that may not be quite as possible to that extent if you were to use more of a black box approach. And then I think I saw another one come up. Oh yes, in the chat. How to identify the list of required apps from which data needs to be extracted for a particular destination or event to be studied. So I think our approach has generally been take as much data as you can get, which actually brings me to kind of the second type of approach that people might take for normalization and why we've chosen to lean away from that. So another approach that you might take to normalization is to say, I am going to restrict myself to a balanced panel, which sounds very good in theory, right? But then you're losing a lot of the ability to extrapolate out from data that may disappear if you had taken that out, right? So you might think I can just remove data until I have a panel that's pre-balanced, and then I don't have to do any of this sort of sophisticated weighting on it. That may work under conditions where you have really, really high coverage, but like we know, you might want to be able to zoom into particular places or time where the coverage might not be that high, and you run the risk in restricting yourself to a particular set of apps or to a particular pre-balanced panel. You might be removing data that provides perfectly valid and important information to your destination by taking that approach. So it's something that, you know, we're aware is sometimes used. We've looked into that type of approach internally. And, you know, we really decided to pay the price of developing some of these more sophisticated methodologies in order to continue to leverage basically all of the data that you could reasonably have access to, and then do that balancing through the mathematics on top of it.
All right, there's one more here, kind of jumping off the stadium comment I made. In your reporting, do you recommend aggregating your POIs together? Yes. To serve as an overview of your destination, or would you recommend analyzing the POIs separately? I mean, the answer is both, which is why like selection of those POIs and that place-based strategy is so critically important. So going back to that kind of time and reliability that Lexi had on one of those slides, you know, if you want to understand your top origin markets to certain stadiums, certain key, like marquee, huge destination drivers, certainly drilling down into that POI level is okay, as long as, you know, we're looking at large time frame and you're paying attention to that sample size, but absolutely aggregating. We bucket all of points of interest for our partners into categories as well, right? So that's another level of aggregation that's super helpful to understand, okay, my Philadelphia market, they tend to be observed in restaurants only on our west side of town. Compared to another, you know, again, roll up of restaurants, maybe on the, you know, east side of town, that type of thing. But certainly looking at your destination, you know, as a whole as well, it kind of all starts at the POI, right? And then you can roll up into categories, regions, and neighborhoods, and the whole destination. So great question.
Yeah, so another question about the weights. Do I have it right that the weights are from the data gathered in the geolocation data? Yeah, so I think that that's part of, you know, in understanding the data, you understand what adjustments need to be made in order to derive the weights. So yes, generally, but I would say there's another piece to the puzzle, which is that you also have to take into account what are the relevant types of insights that you're going to be displaying, right? Because there's a million different measurements that you can make on the data. If it's not ultimately relevant to the insights that you're trying to measure or to the device's, you know, propensity of being seen as it relates to what you're trying to answer, then that's not really something that you want to be taking into account in your weighting methodology. So that's why I really keep hammering on this point of you really have to know your data. You intimately have to know how the data behaves, what it's capable of, how it changes, and then even preempting some ways that it might change that you haven't seen before. But you also have to know what types of insights and what types of questions are you trying to answer with that data, because the correct normalization methodology lies in connecting those two things up. And that's ultimately how the weights are derived. But yes, it does take into account myriad different real-time measurements and analyses of the data.